The Presocratic Philosophers. The Presocratics were given this name by the aforementioned 19th century scholars, not because all of them predated Socrates, some were his contemporaries, but because the scholars recognized a significant difference of interest between them and Socrates. This is, that the Presocratics were concerned with questions about the nature and origins of the world, whereas Socrates focused his attention on ethics. Accordingly, the scholars, following Aristotle's name for them, describe the Presocratics as physicoi, physicists. Before giving an account of each of the major figures individually, it is useful to see where they fit in the first millennium of philosophy. The first of the physicoi came not from Athens but from Ionia, a flourishing group of cities originally founded by Athenians on the eastern shores of the Aegean Sea. One of the cities, Miletus, was home to Thales, regarded by the Greeks themselves and by all historians of philosophy since as the father of philosophy. Of course, he was no such thing. It cannot be the case that in the scores of thousands of years of human history before the 6th century BCE, no one had speculated about the nature and origins of the universe. Indeed, for several millennia before Thales lived, great civilizations were flourishing in Mesopotamia and along the Nile, possessed of astronomy, architecture, bureaucracy and writing, and based on great cities and organized economies. There must have been many thousands of citizens of these elaborate cultures who pondered philosophical questions. But Thales is the first person we definitely know of who wondered about the nature and origins of the universe. And not only wondered, but put forward ideas about them which are distinctively philosophical rather than religious or mythological in character. More on this shortly, because it is indeed a significant matter. We do not know Thales' dates of birth and death, but we do know that he was said to have predicted an eclipse that took place in 585 BCE. So this date is taken as roughly the midpoint of his life. His floruit, he flourished. The traditional way of viewing the history of early philosophy is to connect the members of a geographical school of thought as if they were members of a real school, with pupil following teacher. This might be right, and I think probably was, even if sometimes a figure identified as someone's pupil might more accurately be described as a follower or as a younger colleague. In any event, history gives Thales a pupil, Anaximander, who likewise had a pupil, Anaximenes, and these three are bracketed together as the first Ionian philosophers. Whereas Thales and his Ionian successors lived on the eastern margin of the Greek world, the next significant steps in the story were taken on its western margin, in the Greek colonies of southern Italy. Pythagoras, he of the theorem about the square on the hypotenuse, in fact came from Ionia originally, but transplanted himself to Croton on the heel of Italy. The city of Elea, not far from Croton, was the birthplace of a towering figure in early philosophy, Parmenides. The adjective Eleatic is therefore applied to him and to the school of philosophy he founded, with his principal followers being Zeno and Melissus. Contemporary with Zeno was Empedocles, from Acragas in Sicily. Parmenides is one of the two greatest of pre-Socratic philosophers. The other is Heraclitus, whose birthplace was back across the Greek world in Ionia. Towards the end of their lives, Heraclitus was slightly the older of the two. Parmenides was still alive when Socrates was born in 470 BCE. The seat of philosophy became, and for several centuries thereafter almost exclusively remained, Athens. Athens saw, apart from Socrates himself, the flourishing of Protagoras, the Sophists, the atomists Leucippus and Democritus, and then Plato and Aristotle, and after the latter the schools of Epicurus, the Cynics and the Stoics. In the final century of the first millennium BCE, the centres of philosophy began to multiply again, including Rome and Alexandria as increasingly important homes of debate and inquiry. The last great philosophical movement of antiquity, Neoplatonism, which began with Plotinus in the 3rd century CE and flourished until the 7th century CE, included thinkers associated with those two cities as well as Athens and elsewhere. Such is an overview of ancient philosophy, 1,000 years of it, stretching from the beginnings with Thales of Ionia, through Plato, Aristotle, Epicureanism, Stoicism, which provided the outlook of many educated Hellenes and Romans until the advent of the Christian era, and finally Neoplatonism. We now look at the leading figures in this story in more detail.